I'm John Kramer, and this is Totally 80s. Here in my hands, I hold the recently published Detective Comics number 1000. This comic marks 80 years since Detective Comics number 27, which was the first appearance of the Batman. But it also marks 30 years since Tim Burton's Batman. Now, when I was a kid, back in the 1970s, I had two Batmen, Olin Soleil and Adam West. Olin Soleil was the voice of Batman in my favorite cartoon of all time, The Super Friends. And Adam West, I watched him in reruns of the 1960s Batman TV series. But Adam West also was in a very, very short-lived live-action TV show called Legends of the Superheroes. And he also voiced Batman in the Filmation cartoon The New Adventures of Batman. Now, for anyone who wasn't aware, the 1960s Batman TV series was campy. It was tongue-in-cheek, as was Legends of the Superheroes. Now, the cartoons weren't as campy, but they most definitely were not dark or gritty. So, to sum things up, the Batman of my childhood was fun and witty and not so gritty. Yeah, I'm a poet. But all of this changed dramatically. Emphasis on dramatically, in 1986, because of a guy named Frank Miller. Frank Miller was a comic book writer / artist who wanted more from Batman. He wanted a hard-boiled detective. He wanted a vigilante. So he gave us The Dark Knight Returns. Now, The Dark Knight Returns was a 4-issue comic book miniseries that was about a 55-year-old Batman returning to fight crime after a 10-year retirement. But this isn't your average run-of-the-mill comic book. This book was dark. And when I say dark, I mean dark. It's noir. It pits Batman against Superman. The Joker commits suicide. Alfred dies. It's definitely not the Batman that I grew up with in the 60s and 70s. It was the beginning of a new Batman for the 1980s. But he wasn't completely new. Yes, he was more violent, but he was really no darker or grittier than the Batman found in the early pages of Detective Comics back in the 30s and 40s. After all, the 30s and the 40s were the golden age of pulp magazines and films noir and hard-boiled detectives. That's when Dashiell Hammett wrote The Maltese Falcon and Raymond Chandler wrote The Big Sleep. So really, there's a little bit of poetry in what Frank Miller did here. His story is called The Dark Knight Returns because The Dark Knight returns after having been in retirement. But the Dark Knight of the 1940s also returns, having been in retirement throughout the 1960s and 70s. And then, in 1987, Frank Miller did it again when he wrote or rewrote Batman's origin story in Batman Year One. This was also a 4-issue series, but found within the actual Batman title itself, issues 404 to 407. And in this story, Bruce Wayne first began his crime-fighting career without a costume. He simply wore a military jacket and a black knit hat. And he quickly and painfully learned that he couldn't beat the criminals by skill alone. All the training in the world wouldn't help him unless he could strike fear into his opponents. And then one evening, beaten, bruised, and bloody, and he's sitting in his study. I've done it again. And he's feeling like he's failed his life's purpose because he's unable to avenge his parents' death. And then it happens. The sign he's been waiting for. A bat comes crashing through the window. And Bruce has an epiphany. He shall become a bat. And then, in 1988, Alan Moore gave us The Killing Joke. Now, The Killing Joke was a standalone graphic novel, and it is by far my most favorite of all graphic novels. It's a possible origin story of the Joker, inspired by a previous story published in Detective Comics, back number 168, published back in 1951. And in this possible origin, a criminal called the Red Hood falls because of Batman into a vat of chemical waste. He survives and escapes, but is left with green hair, chalk white skin, and ruby red lips. And the story goes on to say that given the right circumstances, anyone can become a psychopath. And then, in 1989, we were given Tim Burton's Batman. Now, when my friends and I first heard that Tim Burton would be directing this up-and-coming Batman film, we were a bit unsure, because he had just directed Pee-wee's Big Adventure. Now, don't get me wrong, I loved Pee-wee's Big Adventure, and it was weird and it was funny, but how would all of that translate over to Batman? Were we just going to get the campy Batman of old? Would Tim Burton even be capable of giving us some Frank Miller-esque, grit and dirt? And then to add to our doubt, Tim Burton cast comedian Michael Keaton in the lead role. Now, Michael Keaton had just been in a film called Clean and Sober, where he played a serious role of a recovering drug addict. So we knew he had the potential, but if he were thrown into the ring with Tim Burton, again, would we just get Beetlejuice revisited? And with the news of Michael Keaton being cast, rumors were now spreading that Eddie Murphy was going to be Robin. Now I don't know how serious anyone took these rumors, but there were still fears that this film could very easily go south. Until it was announced that Jack Nicholson would be playing the Joker. So if everything else in the film failed, we knew we'd at least get, something good out of this movie. Even if Jack just recycled his role from The Shining, we were in for a real treat. So on opening night, my friends and I went to go see the film. And I must confess that on the first viewing, I didn't like it. I think my expectations were too high. There'd been too much hype. But I specifically didn't like how many liberties had been taken. In the comics, Joe Chill shot Batman's parents, not the Joker. And why on earth did Alfred tell Vicky Vale that Bruce Wayne was Batman? And at the end of the film, the Joker dies. You can't kill off the Joker. Well, unless, of course, you're Frank Miller. But even then, he killed a future Joker. So I left the theater pretty frustrated. And I stewed about it for much longer than I should have stewed about a movie. But I felt a bit betrayed. I felt like Tim Burton had ruined Batman. But after a few days, I came back to my senses and I quit being so angry about a trivial movie. And I started to think things through a bit more logically. And I realized that if the filmmakers were going to try to fit an origin story into a 2-hour window, well then, the movie couldn't follow canon. Because in the comics, we'd had 50 years to tell this story. But in the film, we only had 120 minutes. So, like The Killing Joke, Tim Burton had to create a possible past. And I had to treat this movie more like a one-off graphic novel than, say, 4 issues within a comic series. To introduce Joe Chill and then never use him again would have been a waste of time and a waste of a character. So, Joe Chill and the Joker had to be combined. And for the sake of resolution and closure, Vicky Vale had to learn Bruce Wayne's secrets, and the villain had to die. So I went back and I saw the movie again with my new and improved attitude. And the fact that I'm still talking about this film 30 years later lets you know that I loved it. It was one big German expressionist masterpiece. It was The Man Who Laughs meets Nosferatu. It had the criminal underworld of F.W. Murnau's M and the grungy, pillared, pipe-laden backdrops of Fritz Lang's Metropolis. And it was the new Batman of the 1980s. Just like The Dark Knight Returns, this film was dark. So dark, in fact, that moviegoers complained that they couldn't see what was going on. And if you saw this movie at the drive-in, well, you didn't see much at all because it was just too dark. So when it was released on video, it was graded slightly lighter to improve the viewer experience. And if you want to keep talking dark, how about the Danny Elfman score? I'm not an Oingo Boingo fan, but this score proves that Danny Elfman is a composer. In this magnum opus, I hear everything from, John Williams in the Batman theme to Carl Orff in Descent into Mystery, and then Tchaikovsky in, Waltz to the Death, Weather on Top of Gotham Cathedral, and Vicky Vale in The Joker Dance. Now, as for the Joker, his character in the film is Jack Napier, obviously an homage to Alan Napier, who played Alfred in the 1960s TV series. And as for the Joker's origin in this film, it's obviously an homage to The Killing Joke. Criminal falls into toxic waste, comes out a clown. Now, my copy of The Killing Joke is a first print, so it doesn't have this. But later printings have a Tim Burton quote right on the cover, which reads, "I loved The Killing Joke. It's my favorite. It's the first comic I ever loved." And the first thing that I ever loved about Tim Burton's Batman is the fear. The fear the criminal underworld had of the Bat. And this fear is straight out of Batman Year One. Case in point, the movie's opening scene. Thug 1 and Thug 2 have just mugged a family, which also foreshadows the murders of Thomas and Martha Wayne. And while divvying up the spoils, Thug 2 mentions the rumors of a supernatural creature, a beast-like vigilante known as the Bat, who sucks its victim's blood and then drops its prey from 5 stories up. Thug 1 mockingly disbelieves, that is until he hears the crunch of footsteps behind him, and turning, he sees for himself the Bat. Thug 2 was then kicked through a door. Thug 1 runs, but doesn't get very far because of the batarang wrapped around his ankle, by which he is then, dragged to the ledge of the building. Thug 1 screams for his life, "Don't kill me, man, don't kill me!" To which the vigilante calmly responds, "I'm not going to kill you. I want you to do me a favor. I want you to tell your friends about me." And then Thug 1 cries out in total fear, "What are you?" The demon then pulls him in close and responds, "I'm Batman." Now, in the comic book adaptation of the film, the scene is a bit different. And that's because the comic must have been written, based upon an earlier script. So in this comic version, when Thug 1 is being dangled over the edge of the building, Batman says, "You're trespassing, rat breath." And then the thug responds, "Trespassing? You don't own the night." And then Batman responds, "Tell your friends. Tell all your friends. I am the night." Now, I kind of like this, but at the same time I don't, and I'm glad that the change was made. Simply because I don't like the idea of Thug 1 having his wits about him enough to even talk back to Batman. Because if he can respond like that, then he's not frightened enough. I want my criminals to have to go home and change their underwear after having a run-in like this with the Batman. I don't want back and forth banter. I want complete and total fear. The same fear that we got in Batman Year One. Now, this movie came out the summer before my senior year of high school. So just before that, my friend Paul had been elected student body historian for the up-and-coming school year. Now, I have no idea what a student body historian does. But the only reason people ran for this office in my high school was because the historian got to change the marquee. So Paul would post any up-and-coming activities or school plays or parent-teacher conferences. But if there were no school announcements, then the marquee was an empty canvas. And Paul was given freedom to put up whatever he wanted, as long as it wasn't crude or offensive. So, one, open week of no announcements, he chose to post a quote from Tim Burton's Batman. And the quote he chose had erupted from the mouth of the Joker. So in big, bold, capital letters, Paul posted, "This town needs an enema." Now, to those of us who had seen Batman, this was hilarious. And to those of us who hadn't, well, let's just say that this, along with a few other offenses, led to Paul's removal from office. So anyway, despite all the similarities this movie has to the dark comics of the 1980s, I still have to ask myself, even today, did Tim Burton give us a serious Batman or a campy Batman? With dialogue like "this town needs an enema" or "never rub another man's rhubarb," I'm drawn towards the campy. But with that opening scene that I described earlier, I lean more towards the edgy. In all reality, I think he gave us both. And I think he had to. Because, if you're going to make a movie about a man running around in a bat costume, well, then things are going to get campy. Because nobody in our world does that. If you want to remove the camp, well, then you're going to have to remove the guy in the bat suit. This is actually one of the problems I had with the Christopher Nolan films. Nolan gave us a Joker that rivaled Hannibal Lecter in insanity and depravity. But we still had a man wearing tights with his underwear on the outside. So, you'd get me into it, and then you'd lose me as soon as Batman showed up. Because Christopher Nolan went for realism, but using a character that doesn't exist in my reality. So to me, Tim Burton's Batman will always be the greatest of all the Batman movies. Now, I don't know, is it because I think it's a better story? Is it because the Christopher Nolan films are just too violent? Or is it just simply because Tim Burton's Batman came out in the end?